Welcome to this season's first edition of Thought Hockey. Today's video was going to be about what's wrong with the Vancouver Canucks, but seeing how they've recorded their first win, I'm going to turn my attention to what's wrong with the Toronto Maple Leafs. All right, hockey fans, I'm listening. I'm taking your calls. Let's go to the phones. First, we've got Gino in Maple.
Hey, Data, first-time caller, long-time listener.
Welcome aboard.
The Leafs, they're just not tough enough. We need a good enforcer to protect these guys. Hey, thanks for taking my call. I'll hang up and listen.
Well, Gino, that's true. The Leafs are certainly not the 1991-92 Buffalo Sabres. But even if they did have a top-notch fighter on the roster, there aren't many guys left in the league who he'd even be able to fight. I'm not sure that's the answer, but thanks for the call. All right, let's go to Alex in Scarborough. What do you got for me, buddy?
It's Justin Hall. The guy's gotta go. No, wait, I mean, it's Engvall. He cost us the whole game. Well, actually, it's Nylander. The guy is a bum. As long as we have him here, we're going nowhere. Nowhere!
Thanks for the call, Alex. I do admire your passion. And although I know Engvall and Hall definitely haven't been great this year, and Nylander can be frustrating at times, I don't think we can just pin it all on one guy or even three guys in rotating intervals. All right, we got time for one more. Let's go to Scott in Oakville. Scott, you're up.
Come on, Dana. Everybody knows that John Tavares is the most overrated, overpaid player in the league. Why did we even sign this guy? He and the other big three take up all this cap space. Dubas doesn't know what he's doing. Why did he spend so much of the cap on four guys? And Keefe, he's completely lost the room, and he hasn't done anything to get these guys going. He's in over his head.
All right, Scott, thanks a lot. Some good points, and that's definitely some of the stuff I hear a lot of Leafs fans bringing up. But let's remember, without COVID, there's a good chance the salary cap would be hovering somewhere slightly above 90 million right now. There's a good chance a player like Nathan MacKinnon would be getting a contract worth close to 15 million at this point, and we'd all be sitting back in our chairs talking about what a bargain John Tavares is at 11 million. The team is, of course, right up against the cap, but nobody could have predicted we'd have 2 years like we did the past two. And you can't blame Kyle Dubas for COVID. Can we? And as for Keefe, none of us are in that room. So I don't think it's fair for us to speculate on how the room feels about him. I want to thank everyone who called in. I do appreciate the support. Don't forget to like and subscribe. So let's look at a couple of things. Are my callers right? Probably not really. I think a lot of those things that get brought up are kind of some snap judgments, some rush decisions on the part of fans, and they're not really looking at all the variables. They're usually taking one or two things that happen in a game, something they heard on Hockey Night in Canada, something they heard on Sportsnet, and then they're just attributing that to everything that's wrong with the season. But are they completely wrong? Maybe not. So is team toughness an issue? Yeah, I think I would say it is, but not so much in the drop your gloves sense of team toughness. The Leafs are just really easy to play against most nights in that they rarely drive to the net hard. They're not intimidating between whistles where a lot of the battles are taking place in today's game. And they just don't make opponents pay the price for going to the net, playing pucks along the boards, and that sort of thing. Too often I see a Leaf player abandoning a one-on-one situation for the puck or surrendering body position. Maybe there's some analytic that says 52.7% of the time the player who goes in first doesn't come out with the puck. But I don't think that in all of these situations, coming out with the puck is the entire equation. I'd also go so far as to say that the toughness end of things and the sticking up for each other is something that goes all the way up and down this lineup. If you have players like Matthews and Marner, Nylander, Tavares, who are all highly skilled players but aren't exactly the types of players who engage physically, you do want to back them up with some other guys who are going to take a little bit of that role on for them. Now, I'm not saying we're looking for the next Ken Baumgartner or Fraser McLaren here, but it'd be nice to be the team that's giving out the face washes and the jabs after the whistle for once. And please don't bring up Wayne Simmons. Wayne's a great guy, great player, amazing to have him here. I love him for coming home and being that guy who is trying to live out a childhood dream by pulling the Leaf sweater over his head. But I think the player we need is the 2014 to 2018 Wayne Simmons. So can we all just jump on a scapegoat? Can we Larry Murphy or Brian McCabe this one? Well, I'm not exactly a Justin Hall fan. The thing I usually say about him is the only thing scarier than Justin Hall with the puck is Justin Hall without the puck. Hall should probably be a number 6 guy on any NHL team he might play for. But injuries and the fact that he did look really good during the COVID season when he was riding shotgun for Jake Muzzin may have put him a little higher up the lineup than he should be. And I just think he's really out of place. For what we've seen over the last season and a bit that started this year, I don't think anyone wants him playing anywhere up in the lineup. Engvall, who is another of the more recent whipping boys, really is struggling, I think, to find a place this season. And it's just really not working out for him. But I'm not going to blame it all on that guy. That's for sure. William Nylander, he's a bit of a lightning rod ever since joining the team, basically. I really like his offense as a player, but as I've mentioned in other videos before, it seems to me like he just has zero appreciation or interpretation of what he's supposed to do on defense. I'd probably only be giving him about a 10 in toughness if I was doing the ratings for NHL, whatever year we're on right now. But like I said before, it would be nice to pair him up with someone who's got a little more of that edge, or maybe even just a more defensively responsible forward who can balance off a little bit to allow William to do the things we like him to do, which is score those sweet, sweet goals. So it's got to be Dubas's fault then, right? This is the one I just can't get behind wholeheartedly. Like I said before, the COVID salary cap restrictions have really made it difficult on him, but I think he's done a really good job the past few seasons at assembling some pretty good rosters without a whole lot to work with. Now, part of that has been convincing some local boys to come home. And like I said about Simmons, fulfilling a childhood dream by pulling the Leaf sweater over their head. See Spezza, Jason, and Giordano Mark. And since I'm going to let Kyle off the hook for anything he did pre-COVID, let's take a look at what he's done in the past 2 off seasons and last season and so far into this season. In spite of not making any major moves in the offseason leading into the 2021-22 season, the Leafs looked pretty good on paper, but there were some question marks. They brought in a few guys named David Kampf, Andre Kasha, and this kid from Scarborough named Michael Bunting, who was going to be a 24-year-old rookie who could barely crack the Arizona Coyotes lineup. The other 2 bigger acquisitions that the Leafs made was signing Peter Mrazek to be Jack Campbell's backup and also bringing in Nick Ritchie from the Bruins, who was an unrestricted free agent because they didn't tender him a qualifying offer on his RFA deal. Now, we all know how the Ritchie and Mrazek deals turned out. I was critical early on the Mrazek deal, but not because I didn't like the player. I thought the contract was probably 1 year too long and looked about $1 million too much. Ritchie should have been great. Everything was set up perfectly him to succeed in Toronto, but he just never really fit in. He could have been the big guy. He could have been the tough guy. He could have been the left winger that they needed on either of their top 6 units. But on too many nights, he just looked like he couldn't keep pace, couldn't find his way, and the results just never materialized. In spite of all the chances he had from the coaching staff, Nick Ritchie was just never that guy. So with Kampf, Kasha, and Bunting, they all made an impact on the team almost right away. Kampf was great on faceoffs. He was a good penalty killer. And even though he had only scored 1 goal in his previous season, contributed some offense almost right away. Andre Kasha was a spark plug. He was great on the third line with Kampf because as much as Kampf is a bit of a low event player, Kasha is all over the place. A good hard forechecking, speedy guy who often found himself upside down at least once or twice a game. Michael Bunting, to the surprise of most, was outstanding on the first line. He was a 5-on-5 monster. He scored 23 goals, and he was on quite a few people's Calder ballot. Those 3 players combined only cost the Leafs around $3 million against the cap, and all 3 were significant contributors. Never mind how much they contributed on the ice, but the fact that those roster spots were taking up very little cap space meant so much to the team because those players worked out. Another underrated move for Dubas was during the expansion draft, where basically all he gave up to the Seattle Kraken was the 7th-round pick he used to bring in Jared McCann from Pittsburgh. That was a real shrewd move by Kyle. Now, during the season, Dubas was able to trade away the problem in Richie, and in doing so, he brought back Ilya Lyubushkin, a player who was amazing down the stretch and filled a really good shutdown role that I think the Leafs needed. The team had to move off Travis Dermott, who was traded to Vancouver, but in doing so, it freed up a little bit of cap space that the team needed to bring in Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell from Seattle. Giordano was one of the highest rated analytical defensemen since joining the Leafs. And the fact he came back to the team for the tiny little contract that he signed is just a great get for Kyle as well. So even if the Leafs didn't live up to the playoff expectations that the fan base had, I can't just sit here and say, oh, Kyle didn't do anything to make the team better, or Kyle didn't make moves, or Kyle just tied up his salary cap and that's why they lost. He was able to fix an off-season mistake in season without giving up anything and got a player back who was useful. He also made a big move at the deadline for one of the players acquired on that day who actually had the biggest impact on his new team. So let's take a look at Kyle Dubas's offseason this year. It seemed the plan was simple. The first move was finding someone to take Alex Kerfoot, a useful player, but at $3.5 million, you need to move off that contract so that you can spread that money around to other players. Moving off of Justin Hall and his $2 million cap hit would have also made it a lot easier to work out the deals for Timothy Liljegren, Rasmus Sandin, and also could have partially been used to make sure that Giordano was staying. The Leafs also needed to figure out what they were going to do with Jake Muzzin. Was he going to be healthy enough to play? Did they still want him on the team? Could he still deliver the type of play that his $5.65 million cap hit would demand? Because if not, that money could go a long way to signing a big name free agent that the team may have wanted to bring in. The last thing on the list was get the heck rid of Peter Mrazek. It was clear this guy was not going to be able to play another season in Toronto after what he gave the team last year. Aside from a pretty decent move, swapping out your late first round for Chicago's early second round pick in a deal for Mrazek, Kyle wasn't really able to accomplish any of the other things that I think the fan base and the media were expecting. So the Leafs went into the offseason, into the free agent period, looking pretty much like they did when their season ended. I think one of the worst moves Kyle Dubas has made in his entire time as Leafs GM is the trade for Matt Murray. To me, this was just a bad situation to put a player like Murray in, a player who seemed to be going nowhere fast, in spite of the fact he did have some encouraging signs near the end of last season, and exposing him to a pressure-filled mega media market like Toronto and replacing part goalie, part golden retriever Jack Campbell. Although Dubas gave up nothing to get Murray, Ottawa only retained 25% of Murray's $6.25 million salary. That 4.7-ish million remaining is way too high, way too risky for me. That's only about $300K a year less than what Edmonton ended up paying Jack Campbell. That's only $500K less than what Washington paid Stanley Cup winner Darcy Kemper. And it's $1 million more than Colorado paid for Georgiev, and Ottawa is paying Cam Talbot, who they traded for almost immediately after dumping Murray. Now, Campbell hasn't looked much better than he did in the second half of the season with the Leafs last year, where he did have his struggles. And of course, he and Kemper both got long-term deals, so we do have to factor that into the equation. Cam Talbot also is currently injured, but at the time, I would have preferred any of those three deals over the trade for Murray. Getting Murray took away almost all of the Leafs' remaining cap flexibility. And if you couldn't move off of Kerfoot or you couldn't move off of Hall, you were left without very much you could do to make this team better. The only saving grace on the Murray trade so far seems to be that he's hurt, and the Leafs are able to use his cap space because of LTIR cap savings. So what else did Kyle do this year? Well, he managed to get Mark Giordano to stick around town for only 800K a year for 2 years. That's almost embarrassingly low. And in a way, I kind of feel bad for Mark. I know he really, really wanted to be a Leaf. I think it was rumored he was going to sign for around $1 million, but then they decided to work it back a little bit just to give the team some extra flexibility. The Leafs gave Dennis Malgin another look. They picked up recent Cup winner Nicholas Aube-Kubel and PTO'd Zach Aston Reese into a contract just as training camp was ending. Victor Mete and Jordy Ben were signed as UFAs to round out the D-corps, and Rasmus Sandin and Timothy Liljegren were giving matching 2-year 1.4 per season contract extensions. The biggest deal of the summer was a 4-year 2.1 million annual contract given to Calle Jarnkrok, who had split time between Seattle and Calgary last season. Not much to write home about so far until you look at the last move I'll talk about, which is bringing in Ilya Samsonov in on a $1.8 million contract for 1 season. So far, Samsonov has been the saving grace of the team, and while Murray is injured, he stepped up and played some really big games for the team. So far, Ben and Liljegren have yet to suit up, but it looks like they're almost ready to go and will be joining the team any day now. Mete has looked okay, while Aube-Kubel and Aston Reese have been pretty meh. I don't exactly know what roles they're really filling yet, and I'm not really sure how they're fitting into the team. Jarnkrok has struggled to do much of anything of note this season. I think his usefulness will probably show more as the season goes on, once they really get into a spot where he's comfortable. But until then, another player who's just kind of been meh. I really would have liked to have had Ben at 30, not 35. And aside from the dashes, I think there's probably a couple other guys I may have looked at first to bring in. Could some of the problems with team toughness that the Leafs have had been solved by signing a guy like Nicolas Deslauriers? Well, he got $1.75 million a year for 2 seasons with the Flyers. So that's a contract I wouldn't be going anywhere near to match. I think I might have preferred Calvin DeHaan over Jordy Ben, but maybe I'm just splitting hairs there. DeHaan is younger, and I do still see him as a better player overall, but maybe that's just nitpicking. Josh Manson was probably the right player with the right type of contract that I think the team really needed. Now, he stuck around in Colorado after winning the Cup, so I can't exactly blame him. I think he probably took a little bit of a discount to stay there. I think his contract may have looked a little different if he'd have left, and it probably would have required some sophisticated salary cap gymnastics on Dubas's part to really get that deal done. So I'm not even sure it was ever on the table. Danton Heinen, I thought, was an interesting non-tendered UFA. He ended up going back to Pittsburgh for $1 million a year. I'm just looking and thinking about him over a Calle Jarnkrok, and could that have been something that was done? But considering he was non-tendered but then re-signed with his original team, I have a feeling they probably already had something worked out in Pittsburgh before. So again, not sure that would have even really been available. I think my favorite off the board idea was maybe the chance of pursuing one or both of the Strome brothers who found themselves free agents this summer. Looking at the contracts that they both got, I don't know that it would have been a great fit. And I think there's maybe some holes in each of their games that maybe just wouldn't have worked with this roster anyway. Now, the most talked about players the Leafs did not retain from last year would have been one Ilya Mikheyev, who I don't think was staying anyway. He had asked for a trade even during the lockout season, so I don't know that that was going to work out. And I know he's off to a pretty decent start with Vancouver, but I don't see him really living up to the contract that he signed. The other guy it would have been nice to keep would have been Ilya Lyubushkin, but he's getting paid $2.75 million a year for 2 years in Buffalo. Honestly, they can have him for that. And that brings us to goaltender Jack Campbell. Now, I don't think Campbell ever really did anything that made me think he was worth a 5x5 deal that he got with the Oilers. And when you look at his lackluster play in the second half of last season, after an amazing first half, especially in the month of November, I think a contract that long and that high was just too risky. If Dubas had been able to make the moves that I think the fans were expecting, getting rid of a couple of those contracts and exploring some of the players in free agency that everyone seemed to be hoping for, I think going after Murray probably wouldn't have been that bad, especially if Ottawa had retained 50% instead of 25%. Seeing as how he kept Kerfoot and Hall, if he'd have gone a slightly different direction with the goaltending and not brought in Murray, I think the team still works out okay as well. But he didn't make those moves, and he brought in what I think is a way overpriced goaltender who is likely to underperform and because of injuries may not even play at all. That just makes working things out and operating this team that much more difficult. Now, I don't know Kyle Dubas, but I think I know a little bit about how he thinks and why he does what he does. I don't think Kyle likes to be told what to do or feel like he's being told what to do. And he wants the ideas he has to be his own rather than look like he's been pressured by outside sources to make a move, sign, or trade a player. He showed this a few years ago back with the "we can and we will" speech about retaining his, at the time, 3 young burgeoning superstars. I feel kind of like when Kyle thinks he's backed into a corner, or that the perception is that Kyle's backed into a corner, he's going to try to get out of that corner without having to admit he was ever in that corner to begin with. If I was running a team, I'd stay away from making the bold statements like he has had a bit of a tendency of doing. I just wouldn't give anyone the ammunition to use against me. I genuinely like the job Dubas has done in spite of some of the difficulties that have been put before him. Kyle's kind of been like Candice Bergen in those old Sprint ads. He's getting the most for the least out of his bottom 6, third pairing, and depth players, all the while walking the tightrope of the salary cap with the big 4, Morgan Rielly and Sheldon Keefe. I think what it really comes down to is something I've brought up a number of times before about this team. There seems to just be an overall lack of intensity on the part of some of the team's bigger stars. The top players on this team are extremely talented, well-paid young men who likely feel invincible and emboldened by their newfound superstardom. However, their inability to maintain the level of intensity needed to win in this league throughout their failures and disappointments over the years, they don't seem to appreciate their own culpability in the team's shortcomings. Only John Tavares and Morgan Rielly ever seem to be affected in a meaningful way by the year-after-year playoff exits, while in my estimation, Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews are more upset by people who want to blame them than any actual responsibility that they should be bearing. William Nylander is a guy who I don't think really takes a lot of blame for this. He makes a lot less, and I think just generally he's around less to answer questions. And to me, maybe the media just thinks of him as just a Swedish guy. So a lot of times the story behind him is not going to be as biting or as salacious to satisfy the appetites of the Leafs faithful. I will say that whenever I hear Austin Matthews refer to the team's play as unacceptable, but then I go on to watch the team continually play in unacceptable ways, it just makes me want to bang my head off the desk. All right, so the Leafs could be tougher. Yes, they could maybe even manage the salary cap a little bit better. And yes, some players on the team do seem like passengers some of the time. But at the end of the day, when you have 5 potential all-stars in your lineup and the talent level that most teams can only dream of, those 5 players, and to a lesser extent the players beneath them, really need to realize that they're the ones who need to do it. They're the ones who need to step up. And if they don't, they're going to hear the criticism from either the media, from the fan base, or just the hockey world in general. And lastly, if the players aren't willing to get the job done, then it's up to the people above them, the coaches and management, all the way up to the top, to find other players who will. Because as the old saying goes, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So let me know what you think. What's wrong with the Toronto Maple Leafs? Leave a comment below. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.